Hello, everyone. It's Monte coming to you from my new city where I am settling in. As you can probably tell because you're hearing from me now instead of at the end of the episode, this is a special one. I had the opportunity to talk to Rynn Kerkhove of Zoned Out, a city planning podcast, about the city Unending, some of my inspirations for it, and its relationship to other cities, both real and fictional. I hope you enjoy this special bonus episode. It's also out on their feed, which you can find at Zoned Out. And I will see you again soon. Bye.
Hello. Welcome to a joint episode of Zoned Out, the podcast where we interrogate the capitalist city and imagine how the socialist city could replace it, and Tales from Wolf Mountain. We have Monte di Monteleagre here with us today.
Hello, everybody.
To talk about the city unending. Before we get into that, I do want to just talk a little bit about the bonus episode this month. On the bonus episode this month, Josh and I are going to be talking about the Corridor Identification and Development Program from the Federal Rail Administration, talking about some of the proposed train routes that may exist in the coming months, years, decades, centuries, who's to say? If that interests you, go ahead and hop on the Patreon. It's $2 a month. It means a lot to have that support. It keeps the podcast going. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We are here to talk about the city unending. So, Monty, would you like to introduce yourself and the project?
Hi, everybody. My name is Monte di Monteleagre. I am one of the founders and writers for Wolf Mountain Workshop, and we have a podcast called Tales from Wolf Mountain where we release short-run audio fiction stories. Our most recent release is a series called The City Unending, which is a project that I led. It is a project about a surreal city between here and the horizon through which pilgrims will have to travel on their journey west. I wrote 5 of the episodes, and there are 4 additional episodes written by my friends who I've invited to be a part of this collaborative project. Rynn, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely it does. Yeah, I'm really happy you reached out to me to do this. I mean, full disclaimer, Monty and I are
bitter enemies.
Old friends at this point. Yes. Rivals. Eternal rivals at that.
Indeed,
I will see you in the next life, and I will end you.
And I will end you in the life after that. But for now, we live in a place where that's not allowed. Over in the next life where revenge is allowed, that's where things are really going to start heating up. Until then, we've just got podcasts about it.
In the next life, vengeance will replace podcasting.
Exactly. Finally, a healthy outlet for whatever makes people make podcasts.
But yeah, I was very happy when you reached out about this because I've been wanting to talk about fictional representations of cities for a while, and I'm not necessarily well-versed enough to do that, but I think it's a really interesting topic. And the nature of the city unending and how it's written in particular is very cool. It's something that I know you like to do pretty often as a participant in these projects at times, of sort of making it collaborative and open-ended, not putting a ton of guardrails on how different collaborators actually go about creating this city. And I think that ends up painting like a very interesting portrait that, yeah, gets at like a lot of different potential themes, but is never too explicit, I guess. So what was the inspiration for the project, for this series, both artistic and personal?
There were a lot of inspirations for this series. I think that one of the largest ones is living in New York City, which until very recently is the place that I was living. New York City is unique among places that I've lived in that it is a very large city and therefore a very diverse city in every meaning of that word, of course. And when I decided I wanted to write The City Unending, I knew that because The City Unending is about an infinite place, it would be hubristic to pretend that just my perspective would be able to bring that place to life, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I enlisted a couple of my friends, all of whom have some amount of relationship to New York City, That wasn't necessarily what I was looking for. When I was looking for people, I wanted to bring in people whose writing I'd seen before and whose writing I knew I could trust to bring the city Unending to life. And all those people happen to have some amount of relationship to New York City, whether that's where they were living at the time where I asked them to, where they're still living now, or a city that they have another kind of relationship to, like they had left after living for a little bit or living on the outskirts of it and working in the city. There are also a number of creative influences. One of the places that this started for me was I was just thinking about some of these stories. I think it starts with the first story in the first episode, which is episode 4-1 on Tales from Wolf Mountain, about an oracle. That setting is inspired by an apartment that I lived in the Twin Cities back when I lived in St. Paul. And I was thinking about, as I often do, tabletop role-playing games and making an urban fantasy setting. So I was thinking about that and how can I incorporate that idea into it, and it ended up into this larger project of the city Unending, which in a lot of ways is a world-building project.
Yeah, I definitely picked up on that. How the city Unending could easily have been born of a tabletop role-playing session or campaign or group over time, through that type of collaborative process. I also find it interesting how New York City relates to the city Unending, being such a massive and diverse place. Certainly when you listen to the city Unending, you can't help but think of these giant metropolises like New York City as a point of reference. I also thought of other cities, though, too. Cities like St. Louis, which in the American context historically was like a city for pilgrimages, the gateway to the West at the time. And even our hometown of Omaha has played that role in history, being the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. But at the same time, for people from abroad, New York City can function as the gateway to the United States for people who are immigrating here. So New York City just really does feel like it encapsulates the city Unending in so many different ways.
That's really interesting, bringing St. Louis into it. I hadn't really thought about St. Louis a lot as cities that were an impetus for this project. Omaha certainly is, because that's the city that I grew up in and the city that I left New York City for. One interesting thing about the city Unending is unintentionally it ends up being a goodbye letter to New York City, which is not something I meant for when I started working on this project. I think I was deep into the editing stage, so everything had been written and recorded. At least half the episodes were finished and uploaded when I made the decision that I was moving out of New York City. It's interesting in retrospect that this is the last thing I was working on before leaving the city that it is largely in relation to and about.
Yeah.
As far as other cities that kind of influence this, when I think about the city Unending in the context of it being in America, which I don't necessarily believe is true, it's a surreal story, and putting it into a geographical context can be a little bit difficult. It can take some of the poetic nature of the story away, but in my head I always set it in the Denver Rocky Mountains, kind of a what if New York City was located in the Rocky Mountains. And also there's some Utah in a mythical sense there, because I haven't actually spent very much time in Utah, but that is in there as well.
Yes. Well, how could it not be with us playing Dogs in the Vineyard recently?
Yeah, which also was a major influence on this. The city Unending is the framing device of this story is a faith that the text itself does not explore very deeply, but the people that are going to the city Unending on this pilgrimage are going because they have been called by the setting sun to the western horizon, and they will pass through the city Unending on that journey. And the ideas of that faith, and metatextually the flexibility of what that faith means, is largely informed by Dogs in the Vineyard, the TTRPG that me and Rynn were playing when I first started writing this. And it's interesting to see how that informed this as well. A lot of the things I write are informed by tabletop role-playing games.
And the city Unending could absolutely be a setting for one, or actually become its own game in a way. I mean, I could definitely see something like that happening here, where the TTRPG is actually the creation of the city itself, because the city Unending is the only consistent character
Yes.
in the series, right? Like it is both setting and character.
Yes, that's how I view it. A lot of people talk about New York City as a character in the media that it shows up in, and I wanted to try and do that with this piece. I've never fully understood what they mean when they say it, so this, in a lot of ways, is me exploring that question of setting as character. One of the other inspirations on this is a horror podcast called I Am In Askew, which I think a lot of people should go and listen to. It's a really wonderful, relatively short podcast about a man who is trapped in a city that hates him, and hates him in a very real living sense, and also loves him and is obsessed with him. It's a very interesting dichotomy between character and setting.
Yeah, it sounds like that. And the way you and the other authors wrote The City Unending, I couldn't help but feel like the city was a little obsessed with the pilgrims themselves. You know, for the pilgrims, perhaps it feels like the city is just like this uncaring entity, and yet it seems like the city goes out of its way to confound them or aid them at times in bizarre ways. For the listeners, just to kind of maybe give them an idea of The City Unending and what they could picture, what are some of your favorite elements that came out of the process of creating The City Unending?
So one of the things that I discovered early on in The City Unending, and it ends up being one of the rules I included for the other authors, is that The City Unending does not have cars, but used to. We never get a clear answer on why there are no more cars anymore. It's implied that this was a relatively recent change, but the city is built as one that relies on, individual infrastructure of cars to get around, but those don't exist anymore. So what does the city look like now? And we never really answer how people get around in the city. Often it's implied the pilgrims are just kind of walking and wandering through the streets of the city, but we do see crumbling infrastructure of the roadways of the city because they are no longer in use for what they were intended to use. There are also individual parts of the city that I've really fallen in love with. Part of it having to do with cars is in, I believe, this third episode, the second episode that I've written. There is a car dealership, but there aren't any cars anymore, so they're just waiting until there are cars again. And it's kind of the silly, absurd, look at these two people who are foolish sitting on an empty car lot waiting for cars to be around again so they can sell them. And then it zooms into their personal lives and how they live. It's two people that are just content enough in each other's company that this small life is enough for them.
Yeah, I have two threads here that I want to go down. But the first is just that much of The City Unending, the episodes, are vignettes.
Yes.
That's not every episode. Particularly, I think of episode 8, as you are with the same characters throughout it. But I'd say the majority is a series of vignettes, and where you just kind of get these glimpses into the lives of inhabitants of The City Unending or pilgrims themselves on their way through. And I think that's very special. It's like a surreal Humans of New York kind of.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is.
Which I don't mean that to be an insult.
No, I don't take it as one. In a lot of ways that makes sense as a framework to look at what The City Unending is. It's stories that have somehow made it back to the eastern settlements where the pilgrims begin and are being shared with them. So you don't necessarily get a lot of any stories, and most of the episodes are told in vignettes, with, of course, the exception of episode 8. All of the episodes that I wrote are told in vignettes, and I did that intentionally as a way for a framework that the other authors can use, and also a way for them to buck that framework to make their episodes stand out more. So that was a choice that I gave the authors. I believe it's in the rules document that this is the structure of mine. Your structure can mirror this. Your structure can completely ignore this. Whatever is going to work for the story you want to tell to help build The City Unending.
Yeah, definitely. And episode 8, I think, really leads into the unsettlingness of it, of The City Unending. You get a glimpse into some sort of sinister government structure, and the fact that you're used to kind of jumping from one setting or character to the next, one borough from the next, because the city Unending is comprised of districts and boroughs, and all of a sudden you are just sitting with these same people who are enduring the city Unending for, 25 minutes in this episode.
Which is the longest episode, too.
It is, yeah.
The episodes of the city Unending are all under half an hour. Mine tend to be between 15 and 20 minutes. A lot of the other episodes end up being in the 20 to 25 minute range. And then episode 8 is the longest at like 26 or 27 minutes.
Yeah, and it's very well done. Yeah, well, I won't get into it too much so listeners can actually experience it. But yeah, the other thing that I wanted to touch on too is just I think it's really brilliant that said that there are no cars in the city Unending. Because I would argue that American cities would immediately feel like 25% more surreal if all the cars vanished, at least.
I think a lot of American cities would feel way more surreal than that if all the cars vanished. I think really the only exception to that might be New York City. And there's already so many cars in that city. It would still feel very different. Probably better for most of the people that live in New York City who do not own cars. But in Omaha, if all the cars vanished, good luck getting to the grocery store, right? Like, all of a sudden you're presented with a whole infrastructure for something that does not exist, and also you have to adapt to a city that was built for it.
Yeah, the city is completely oversized now for like the individual person to walk through it or bike through it. Like, the act of, walking down the interstate and seeing these massive billboards, suddenly it's like, well, I could read like a normal sized sign just walking by because I'm moving at a pace where it would allow me to do that. But if you're speeding by at 80 miles per hour on I-80, you have to have these giant signs. And it's just, it's suddenly like these mundane aspects of life become bizarre and sort of like, I don't know, monolithic in a way, I guess.
Yeah.
If you could call a billboard that.
Yeah, it's looks like an object of worship now because of...
That's the only reason you could imagine it, is somebody building something so big at that point.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the main reason pilgrims are moving through the city Unending now, because movement is a quintessentially human thing. Passing through a city is something a lot of people can relate to and imagine doing, oftentimes for reasons beyond the practical. So what does it mean to be a pilgrim chasing the horizon in the city Unending? And, are there various themes that came to mind as you were trying to imagine what chasing the horizon represents, or the reasons behind pilgrims doing this?
Sure, I can talk about that a little. I'm going to start by turning it back on you. What does being called to do something mean to you, Rynn?
That's a big question. I can say that for most of listening to the city Unending, I understood chasing the horizon as chasing death.
Okay.
But specifically, like, I don't know, the true death that the pilgrims are trying to reach, because the city so often seems like it's trying to kill you in ways that are not dignified, or at least to the pilgrims read as premature and incorrect, Even though pilgrims do return from the horizon sometimes, for some reason, I just felt like that's what the pilgrims were chasing. Is like there is this true death that they are supposed to have that is virtuous in some way, and the city is standing between them and that death. As far as my belief in, what it means to be called to something, I think there are just so many different ways to interpret that, even for an individual. I don't know that I could nail that down.
And I think with the first part is a valid interpretation of the city Unending. It is one of the ways that I view chasing the horizon, especially being that part of this story is about coming of age, and coming of age can happen at any age for people. The part about traveling through the city alone, there's a lot about here that can be read either as literal or metaphorical death. But in the second part of what you said, of that can mean so many things to so many people, I don't know if I can answer that, is part of the reason I leave that interpretation open for people. And part of the reason that the episodes by the different authors interpret the faith in slightly different or radically different ways is that faith, especially faith in the era that we live in, is very much up to individual interpretation. To be called to do something can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It means a lot of different things to the different pilgrims that we meet in this story. There are pilgrims who are very devout in their faith and bring it up regularly, and their faith is called out by the other ones around them in the city. I'm thinking specifically of episode 4, when the pilgrim is talking to the lion statue in the garden. There are episodes like it wouldn't have been episode 4 that the statue garden in, that's episode 6. In actual episode 4 by Alexander, we have an interview between a pilgrim and someone who we can assume is not a pilgrim, but we don't know for sure, in a public park, who is, first of all, obviously intoxicated, and is talking about the time they've spent in the district of oral copulation and how they wish that they spent more time there, not all their time there, but more time there. And we get this interpretation of this faith that is significantly less restrictive, less conservative than we would normally expect a faith that expects a pilgrimage to be, right? And that leads into the question of what is the city unending to these people? Does the city unending only exist because of the pilgrims' faith, right? We know that the city unending isn't there for the very few pilgrims that are called back east after having reached the horizon. Is the city unending a place that exists purely as temptation to try and stop the pilgrims from completing their journey west? Or is it an ecosystem that exists and the pilgrims are a part of that ecosystem who pass through it? These are things that I don't want to solidly answer because this is a story that is framed by the character's faith, and faith is so often framed by doubt, so that I don't want to have a solid answer to that, because when faith exists in our world, it is so hard to find a solid answer to what that faith means.
That makes complete sense. The fact that the pilgrims almost always, again, aside from episode 8, sort of bucking the trend again, travel alone through the city. It becomes bizarre in episode 8 that a brother and sister have made it as far as they have. So I think that speaks to how individualized the faith can be, because people are having to go through this trial of the city unending, if you can think of it that way, on their own, as a test of their individual faith.
Or as an opportunity to be in a place unlike any place they had ever been before. There is an amount of this that is influenced by me being in New York City through the frame of being in a beautiful place where you don't belong. One of the rules, I believe, that I sent to the authors is that the city unending should almost always be written from an outsider's perspective.
Well, I don't know if this is too personal of a question to ask for the interview.
Yeah, we could find out. We've got an editor.
Yeah. What about New York City made you feel like an outsider, even after living there for a number of years? Because I don't think that you're alone in that feeling among other people who have lived in New York.
New York's unique in a lot of ways as an American city. New York has this attitude of what it means to be a New Yorker. And it's an exclusive attitude because so many people who are not necessarily New Yorkers, although they might be, want to claim parts of that city so that they can profit from it, right? Whether that be through gentrification, whether that be through the way real estate works in New York City, whether that be opening flagship stores in New York City so that people who have traveled from all over the world, even if that still be in the same country that New York City is in, can go and shop at the flagship version of the store they have in their city.
Right.
And that attitude, in a lot of ways, means transplants, like what I was when I was in the city, aren't necessarily granted the status of New Yorker. I wasn't born there. I was only there for 5 years. I haven't experienced the struggle that comes with growing up and existing in New York City. And in a lot of ways, that struggle is a legacy struggle, because there were times where New York City was a much more dangerous place than it is now. And now it is a less dangerous place, but at what cost, right? Like, how did we get to the point where the crime rate in New York City is where it's at now? How did we get to the point where the subway is not as decorated with street art as it was in the 80s and into the 90s? And what did that cost the city? And now that I come to the city in 2019, how long do I have to be there before I get to claim to be a New Yorker, right? And I never really felt like I had earned the right to call myself that, because I was coming from the outside. I was moving into a predominantly not white part of the city. So much of the city is predominantly people of color. And I am a white person renting an apartment. That makes me part of the gentrification of this neighborhood, because I'm coming from somewhere else. So my rent's going to be a little bit higher. If my rent's a little bit higher, that raises everybody's rent a little bit, even if it's not my individual action that's doing that. So there's this constant play of being like, I am in the city. I've come here for a reason to be in this city. Do I feel like I am a New Yorker? Would it be wrong to call myself a New Yorker, right? And that leads to, in a lot of ways, New York is a beautiful place. I'm a big fan of architecture, so in a literal way, it's a beautiful place for me to walk around and just look at things and take pictures of buildings, which is something that I love to do. But it's also a beautiful place in the communities that grow there, in the culture and the arts that it's able to produce, in the way that it's laid out. It's very easy to know where you are in Manhattan at any given point, at any given intersection, and you can find the place that you want to get to. There's a lot that's beautiful about the city, but am I a member of it? Even if I've been here for 5 years, which is the grand scheme of things, is 1.5 mayors, right?
Yeah, the current mayor having also to prove that he's a true New Yorker.
Yeah, no one's immune from it, right? It is an exclusive club. There's no true Scotsman, but there can't be, because of the way people from outside the city want to use and profit from this city.
It's true. The systemic undermining that capitalism creates in communities can absolutely prompt people to cling more closely to an in-group status, a cultural status that helps define a space, because capitalism is the flattening of culture. It erases the human connection that we can have to our place and just repackages it as real estate and dollars and cents and all of that. So it is interesting how a city full of such human diversity at the same time can have such exclusive status, I guess, that is unattainable for many of its residents, but it is understandable how that could come to be. Before we move on, thank you for sharing about your experience in New York City. I mean, a city that big, you know.
What's it good for if I don't get to talk about it on a podcast with my rival?
Exactly. Now that you've left New York City, I can move there. And then in 5 years, I can come back with an even better take about New York City and how I felt like an outsider there.
An informed city planner's take on New York City rather than a playwright's.
Hey, I mean, it's the theater capital of the country, I guess, in terms of sheer volume.
Yes.
Of course, as you know, the Twin Cities technically has more theater seats per capita.
I think it's second place. Did it pass into first place? It was second place when I moved there.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe it is second place. I remember at the time, because I would talk about that with you, but then also just independently in planning school, like it came up too as like this weird little fact.
The Twin Cities are great. I only lived there for a year, but I did not experience the feelings of being an outsider in the way that New York kind of forces you to think about if you are at all aware of your surroundings.
That's that Midwest solidarity.
There you go.
But yeah, I mean, the city unending as an urban planner certainly made me think about how it might relate to contemporary American cities. And I say American cities not because it's the only lens through which you could view the city unending, but I'm going to stay in my lane here. And one thing that I thought about was how the system of boroughs and districts didn't make me think of neighborhoods so much as it made me think of zoning. Because the boroughs and the districts, one example is like the borough loquacious, which it's a borough full of just people talking a lot, right?
Yeah.
That's like it's the borough, and this is in the formula that you gave the writers, right?
The borough adjective.
The borough adjective, right? Exactly. And then there's the borough analysis next door, right? Trying to interpret everything that's being said in the borough loquacious. But that single use, if you will, nature of all of the boroughs made me think of all of the single use zoning that we have in the United States. And again, the segregation of uses that we have in the United States, well, at times certainly justified, also makes for a surreal urban environment if you just take one or two elements out of it. Like if you pull cars out of the equation, suddenly the suburbs become really weird. Like,
yeah.
You can argue that they're weird now, but if you take cars out of it, then it just suddenly is like, why would this ever get created? Right?
Yeah. How would this happen? Why would this happen?
Exactly. And it's just, on a map, if you look at the zoning, it's just a lot of single family exclusive zoning in the suburbs. And so the system of boroughs and districts that had one purpose to them certainly made me think about that.
I think that naming convention is also informed by parts of New York, right? The borough part comes in a lot poetically. I liked the rhythm of those words. I liked the adjective coming after the noun. The districts are inspired largely by like the meatpacking district, which is not for meatpacking anymore, but once that's where the meat was packed, so it became the meatpacking district. Or the garment district,
right.
The financial district in New York City, which still is the financial district of largely the Western world. The name kind of comes from that and is brought to its highest point, right? Like, this is the district of hammers. It is where the tool factory is, right? So that's where that comes from. And the tool factory is on fire because tools are made in a forge. But it's also on fire because the building has an itch and wants to scratch that itch. And this is how a building whose purpose is to make tools scratches out that itch.
Yeah. I mean, the city unending really does pose the big questions, like, what if a building had an itch? Catch on fire.
What if a big mouth opened up and we turned it into a daycare?
Oh my God. That made me laugh out loud. Was it the giant mouth we feed babies to?
Yeah, I think that's what it's called, something like that. It's not an eloquent name. It is the most obvious thing you could call it.
That really got me. I don't know that there's a parallel in American cities that...
To the giant mouth that we feed babies to? Probably not. I hope not.
Yeah.
It would be on the news.
I should hope not, yeah. But yeah, I think like in the ways that the city unending pushes the limits on the surrealism of what a city could be, it can help us look at our own cities and see that, well, in some ways, we are very far removed from the city unending.
Yes.
Like not having a giant mouth that we feed babies to. On the other hand, we are only one or two steps away from our cities becoming surreal in the same way that the city unending can be.
Mm-hmm.
Even the statues were quite interesting and how they came to be in the city, right? And how they are just like these naturally occurring phenomena, at least according to
the statues.
According to the statues, exactly. But of course, the United States has had a lot of conversations about monuments and public statues over the past few years, in the South in particularly, and whether or not we should have all of these monuments to slaveholders still up, you know? It is convenient for people to kind of say, it's natural for this person to be made into a monument and put in public. And I'm not comparing the statues in the city unending to slaveholders, of course, but Yeah.
That lion, I didn't write that episode. Chase wrote that episode, but that lion never owned slaves.
Can confirm.
Can confirm. Canonical. In a series where, it's about faith, so canon is a bit fun to talk about. Canonical, that lion didn't own slaves. I'm sure Chase is comfortable with me making that claim. And I just looked it up. It's not the giant mouth that we feed babies to. It's the mouth that we feed babies to. It is giant, so that is an apt descriptor. But the official name of that daycare is the mouth that we feed babies to.
Are there any boroughs or districts or characters that didn't make it into the series that you wish people knew about or wish had made it in your writing?
I think much like the pilgrims on their journey west, I discover the boroughs and the districts as I am creating them. So there aren't things that I necessarily cut out of my scripts. I don't know if that's true for the other authors, because the way that I write is a journey through this story. So I discover the boroughs and the districts roughly at the same time that the audience listening discovers them, just in a different place, in a different process. A couple of them had their names changed metatextually. That was so that I could make more alliteration happen and make Joseph's day worse. Joseph being the actor who played the guide in the episodes that I wrote, having a wonderful time reading all of the extremely long, complicated, convoluted sentences full of alliteration that I wrote. Because at some point during writing, I thought it would be fun if there was a lot of alliteration in my episodes.
I do love getting that peek behind the curtain of just, the dynamic between author and actor. And just knowing that an author, you have this specific actor in mind and you're just like, I'm going to write something specifically to piss him off.
It was very fun during the rehearsals of him trying to go through a line where 6 or 7 words in a row all start with B and just getting tongue-tied. I was like, well, at least it's a recorded medium. You don't have to say it perfect the first time. You just have to eventually get all of the words so I can stitch it together in post.
Yeah. And he's just like, hey, can you change this and make it easier? And it's like, hey, it's the script.
I can make it harder. I could make it more difficult. Good luck!
I have one idea in mind for maybe, had I written an episode of The City Unending, I would have put in the borough New York City.
A whole city inside the city? A second whole city inside the city? Because we already have one city inside the city. Why not, We've got a desert inside the city. We've got, what did I end up calling it? It's the Clump. The Clump is a city inside the city?
Oh, yeah, the Clump.
Why not put New York City inside the city?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Clump is representative, or not representative, but inspired by Kowloon Walled City, right?
A direct inspiration from that very interesting piece of history.
Yeah. So I think The City Unending is absolutely big enough for all of New York City. All 5 boroughs, baby.
Yeah.
Staten Island, Manhattan,
Congratulations
the Bronx.
on being one of the only people in the world willing to include Staten Island into your direct copy of New York City into The City Unending.
You know what? I changed my mind. It's just the borough, Staten Island. The best part of New York, baby. Staten Island. That's what's making it in.
I went to Staten Island a couple of times on purpose. Mostly to take the ferry there, which is a really enjoyable experience if people are ever in New York City, to just take the ferry from the bottom of Manhattan to Staten Island. It's an enjoyable boat ride. It's fun. I don't believe it costs any money. They leave every either hour or half hour, depending on how the city's budget is going, I guess. Once you get to Staten Island, unless you have a reason to be there, you're probably not going to stay for very long. It is largely suburban. I went there just walking around taking photos of things with friends once. And it was an enjoyable time. I enjoyed my time in
Nice.
Staten Island. It doesn't smell like the rest of New York City.
Oh, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, probably.
Well, Monte, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you want to make sure we get to?
Let me think if there's anything. I'm going to offer for both the people that are listening to this at the end of listening to the City Unending on Tales from Wolf Mountain, and to the people listening on the Zoned Out feed, is that the texts that you're listening to here, what you're actually hearing, is a supplemental text in a larger faith. And this is roughly the equivalent of a pamphlet somebody would hand you about their faith, right? You're not listening to the holy texts. You're listening to a guide from people who are devout in this faith to different degrees about a journey you're going to go on. So, because faith can be interpreted in so many different ways, so can the City Unending, so can the texts that you're reading, so can the guides that you're listening to.
It's like if the Bible was a zine.
Exactly, right? or it's like a Christian zine about the Bible, right? Like, this isn't the end all be all of this faith. This is some people's interpretation of this faith. This is a lot of people's interpretation of this faith in the case of the City Unending, but it is an interpretation of a larger faith. And if you want to go into the City Unending with that context, I'd be interested in you listening to this 9-episode series with that context in mind. Or if you want to interpret it in a different way, this is, I call it a collaborative project because it is, literally. 5 writers, whole bunch of actors, and also audience gets to collaborate in their interpretation of it in their own way.
Yeah, and on Zoned Out, I mean, the thing that we talk about very often is democratizing the city more, you know? So often the places that we live, that we work, that we travel are almost wholly out of our control, you know, as people in those places. Like, you would imagine that if you live in a place, you would have a little bit more direct say over, you know, how it looks, your ability to stay or leave, things like that. And, you know, in a way, I mean, like, the collaborative nature of the City Unending is, I think it speaks to a democratic vision of the city, even if the city itself in the City Unending is about as anti-democratic as it gets. And the city is just this impending force acting upon the pilgrims and residents there.
Aren't all cities, Rynn? As a final note, I'm going to go through the list of 10 inspirations that I sent to the authors when I first asked them to be a part of this project, both as a show of these are some things that I've really enjoyed and respected, and as if you really enjoyed the City Unending, here's some things you can go and look at from there. Hello from the Hallowoods is a queer horror podcast. It is well over 100 episodes at this point. Very early on, you'll meet a undead person named Diggory Graves. So if that's not a huge enticement, I don't know what you want from me. I Am in Askew, which I mentioned earlier, is another horror podcast about a man, the city he lives in, and how much that city hates him. It's well worth your time to listen to that. The Empty Bowl is a meditative podcast about cereal. A lot of the tone of my episodes comes from there. I'm Sorry, Did You Say Street Magic is a tabletop role-playing game about building a city and using tone to make a city collaboratively. Merkborg is a TTRPG about a dying dark fantasy world, but I really liked the way they wrote about their setting and left it largely open to the interpretation of the players and GM. Dogs in the Vineyard, which we talked about earlier. A couple albums, Jenny from Thieves by the Mountain Goats and Disposable Everything by AJJ. And then as far as films, Spirited Away and The Boy and the Heron, big influences. I think that a lot of people, when they take influence from the work of Miyazaki, they kind of just draw pretty hills. The influence that I took was beautiful places that you don't belong, right? You get kind of stuck in Spirited Away, you get stuck in the bathhouse, The Boy and the Heron, you travel to a whole other world with a whole other set of rules, and you journey through it. And then finally, Wes Anderson's adaptions of Roald Dahl's short stories, which you can find on Netflix. I should also say, Tales from Wolf Mountain has several different series on it. If you're interested in The City Unending, that starts with episode 40 or 41, depending if you want to hear the interlude between different seasons. But after you listen to that, stick around, listen to Genuine Radio if you really like horror. That's a great series by Alexander. You'll hear me act in it. There's also some older things we did, Voices from the Umbra, and then I also did Scoundrel and A Bell Tolls, which are 2 short plays that I released as radio dramas a few years ago. Those are all in Tales from Wolf Mountain. Go and listen to those. They're all very enjoyable. It's adult content in Genuine Radio and Voices from the Umbra, so make sure you're in a place to listen to some body horror if you're going to listen to those.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, just knowing you for such a long time now.
As enemies.
Yes, as enemies.
As rivals.
I'm going to say something nice about you as an enemy. We've, over the years, of course, done creative projects together in music and script writing and zine creation. I've always marveled at your creative capacity and the things that you come up with and the way that you weave stories. So I really can't recommend your work enough to anybody who's listening to this, really.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monte.
And now we can go back to the revenge plots.
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, that's it for the August episode of Zoned Out. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Social media links in the description, Patreon link in the description. Monte, where can people find you?
You can find Wolf Mountain Workshop on any social media that matters at Wolf Mountain Workshop, or you can go to our new website, which is wolfmountainworkshop.org. That's .org, because anyone can have a .org address.
All right. Well, thanks, Monte.
Thanks, Rynn. Hi, Monte again. Wow, wasn't that a great little episode? Once again, you can find more about Zoned Out wherever you get podcasts or on their website, which is zonedoutpodcast.neocities.org. So go find them there. You'll really enjoy all their other episodes, and thank you so much for listening to The City Unending. Now go west, Pilgrim. Wolf Mountain Workshop now has a Patreon. You can subscribe at patreon.com/wolfmountainworkshop at $1, $5, or $10 a month to support our shows and to gain exclusive access to our new Discord, the Caves of Wolf Mountain. We hope to see you there, and we thank you always for being a listener. Bye.